Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Wednesday, November 15th, 2017. Hey, Julian Assange, what the hell were you thinking? Arguably the world's most prolific leaker somehow believed that he could secretly communicate with Don Trump Jr., and that communication would not be leaked. And Assange does look pretty bad. Now, one interpretation is that he was trying to cozy up to this young man he regards as an idiot, was trying to play him, and saying, hey, why don't you give me your daddy's tax returns, and that way WikiLeaks won't seem so one-sided, just publishing embarrassing information on Hillary Clinton. And even the most generous interpretation of this has to slam Julian Assange for being an idiot. The least generous interpretation is that he was a fool and a tool whose hatred for Hillary Clinton, which, can be rationalized, nevertheless blinded him to become, wittingly or unwittingly, a tool of the Trump campaign. And what is really insidious is that what can be described as collusion between WikiLeaks and the Trump campaign is wildly being spun as collusion that involves Russia. And, hey, game's over. That's all the proof. It's all right there. Only the proof isn't there. We have yet to see any evidence proving that Russia hacked the DNC and gave that information to WikiLeaks. But that doesn't stop the spinmeisters who promote the Russiagate narrative, who are trying to salvage the reputation of our intelligence agencies. And I commend Kevin Gosztola, the young journalist who really cut his teeth by providing wall-to-wall coverage of the court-martial of a person then known as Bradley Manning. And I've got a lot of respect for Kevin Gosztola. His piece recaps some of the commentary that has followed the information first reported in The Atlantic, hardly a neutral journalistic outlet, and has been picked up by other media. And we've got to remember that this started with a leak from one of the committees on Capitol Hill that's investigating the Russiagate allegations. And after the leaks took place, Don Jr. decided to post what he says is the totality of his exchanges with WikiLeaks. And when you read these, you can't be 100% sure that everything that's posted on a WikiLeaks Twitter account is coming from Assange himself. But you can infer it by the tone of voice and by the kind of familiarity, hey, Don, that these messages exhibit. And so we look at some of the reaction. Leon Panetta, a man who I respected as a member of Congress. I got to know him when he was representing the Monterey area as a Democrat in the 1990s. Then he became Bill Clinton's chief of staff. Then Obama made him head of the CIA, later Defense Department chief. And along the way, I lost a lot of respect for Leon Panetta. But he slams WikiLeaks. The basic message that should have gone out to all campaign individuals, and this is aimed at the Trump campaign as well, is do not interact with the Russians. Do not interact with a foreign adversary that could very well come in and try to influence this election. So Panetta is just leaping over the evidence that's been available to the public, and certainly he's been briefed in all the dark programs, and he may know more than we do. It may even be factual. But the game that's been played to deny us any public view of the evidence that is used to declare and assert these things is deeply infuriating. Tony Blinken, former Deputy Secretary of State under Obama, was on CNN, and he stated WikiLeaks was basically a cutout, Everything that was exfiltrated from the DNC to the Clinton campaign was apparently passed on to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks put it out. So this is pretty close to a direct connection, only it's not. Blinken used the phrase apparently passed on to WikiLeaks. He doesn't have any evidence of that. And he conceded that it's not publicly known exactly what the cooperation coordination was between Russia and WikiLeaks, but he argued this correspondence fits into a pattern of WikiLeaks aiding and abetting Russia's attempts to favor one candidate over another in the election. That's the same pattern that is described in the assessment by the CIA released on January 6th, on which all the corporate media rest their arguments. Well, the intelligence community said it's true, and therefore, we can build a skyscraper on this without any foundation. Now, over on CNN, the proven perjurer, former director of national intelligence James Clapper, reminded viewers that he's not certain if WikiLeaks had wittingly collaborated with Russia, but later said it certainly has the appearance and smell and feel of a developing conspiracy. And so we see that evidence doesn't matter anymore because we all know. Everybody can see it right there as clear as day. Who needs proof? Who needs evidence? The leaks have done it all. But Gostola spoke to Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and intelligence officer in the U.S. military. He was in the Marine Corps. He said there simply isn't any hard data in the public domain to back up these statements of fact. What is known is that a persona using the name Guccifer 2.0 published documents said to be sourced from the DNC on several occasions, starting on June 15, 2016. Guccifer claims to have stolen these documents by perpetrating a cyber operation of the DNC server. However, the hacking methodology Guccifer claims to have employed does not match the tools and techniques allegedly uncovered by the cybersecurity professionals from CrowdStrike when they investigated the DNC intrusion. Ritter also points out that malware at the center of allegations was available on the open market, making it virtually impossible to make any attribution at all, simply by looking at similarities in tools and techniques. Virtually anyone could have acquired these tools and used them. But Russia, Russia, Russia. That is the chant of the day. And over at The Intercept, the media outlet that was funded by Pierre Omidyar and based on the Ed Snowden leaks, they're now turning into defenders of the deep state. It's really surprising. Robert Mackey pens a lengthy piece today. Headlined, "We knew Julian Assange hated Clinton. We didn't know he was secretly advising Trump." And the irony that The Intercept, which at some risk published some of Ed Snowden's leaked documents, certainly not all, certainly not even the majority of them, they now have hired Barrett Brown, the journalist who went to prison after he hacked corporate documents that were later posted on WikiLeaks. Now, Barrett Brown probably knows Julian Assange and his M.O. much better than I do. And he said that he had defended WikiLeaks for releasing the DNC emails because it was an appropriate thing for a transparency org to do. But working with an authoritarian would-be leader to deceive the public is indefensible and disgusting. Brown pointed out in a later tweet, after Assange, again in his sweet talk to Don Jr., asking for tax returns, said, well, if we publish them, it will dramatically improve the perception of our impartiality. That is the real kicker. That means that the vast amount of stuff that we're publishing about Clinton will have much higher impact because it won't be perceived as coming from a pro-Trump, pro-Russian source, which the Clinton campaign is constantly slandering us with. Now, this message can be interpreted a couple of different ways, because the bottom line is that the WikiLeaks, this is presumably Assange, the statement is that the perception is there and that it's being used to slander WikiLeaks. So you can, if you're generous, you can interpret that as saying, well, they're fighting against the perception. But this is also a way to try to seduce Don Jr. into passing along some of Trump Sr.'s tax returns. So is this a heavenly deception in service of a greater goal? Or is it simply collusion? And in reaction to that, Barrett Brown tweeted that Assange, in this case, is complaining about slander of being pro-Trump in the actual course of collaborating with Trump. And I do understand that take on the message that we're now seeing as a leak. Brown followed up. Was WikiLeaks staff lying on November 10, 2016, when they claimed, quote, the allegations that we have colluded with Trump, or any other candidate for that matter, or with Russia, are just groundless and false? Or did Assange lie to them? And is lying part of the game when you run an organization like WikiLeaks that is based on getting people to presumably violate some level of trust to leak a document because it is in the greater public interest to expose that? Well, these are difficult philosophical arguments, but they'll all be lost because we now have, in the minds of the people promoting the Russiagate narrative, collusion between WikiLeaks and the Trump campaign, and they don't even pause for a minute before they then assert that Russia was at the front end of this pipeline. And I think it has fatally damaged WikiLeaks. Would you trust them if you were trying to expose documents? I certainly wouldn't. And that, if that was a goal of the intelligence community, then you've got to score one for them in this episode. There are no heroes here. This is a film noir being unraveled in stages. And it causes a lot of head-scratching and a lot of headaches, if you ask me. Meanwhile, in retaliation for the U.S. requirement that Russia today register in the United States as a foreign agent, the Duma in Moscow approved legislation Wednesday that could require foreign media organizations operating in Russia to label news they produce as the work of a foreign agent. Now, in a good cop, bad cop way, Vladimir Putin is saying, well, you know, this rule may go too far. But I raised this issue on Facebook the other day. Should the BBC register as a foreign agent in the United States? It's a state-controlled media enterprise. And the claims, of course, that RT is simply a Russian propaganda operation are highly exaggerated. But in the current climate, exaggeration, if it's against Russia, is okay. Because we all know they're evil and they are devoted to just, demolishing what's left of participatory democracy in the United States. So there are also other questions about the Foreign Agents Registration Act, why AIPAC, the pro-Israeli lobby, and Turkish groups are not required to register as lobbyists. We know that the enforcement of these rules has been very lax. Just ask Tony Podesta, Mike Flynn. They all found ways around FARA. But this, I think, does set it up as a, clear reaction, a tit for tat. But it also could lead to a crackdown by Russia on foreign news outlets that come to Russia and do critical reporting. So the unintended consequences of this bizarre struggle will become known over time, and this appears to be one of them. The Guardian newspaper published a story today quoting Christopher Steele, the former British intelligence officer who wrote the so-called dossier of dirt about Trump based on his Russian sources. He says that his dossier is 70 to 90% accurate. And that's cited in a new book by Luke Harding, one of the Guardian reporters who handled some of the Snowden reporting back when Glenn Greenwald was a columnist for the Guardian. His new book, it's not subtle. The title is Collusion: How Russia Helped Donald Trump Win. Oh, boy. And I can't evaluate, for example, the most significant charge that is included in the Christopher Steele reports, that Trump was compromised by the Russians. I do think that's entirely possible. And we're learning that Christopher Steele delivered a total of 16 reports to Fusion GPS after the Clinton campaign took over the contract between June and November last year. His sources in Russia started to go quiet in July when the Trump-Russia narrative was launched by the Democrats. And Steele had met in June to brief an FBI contact who he had worked with on the FIFA investigation, the soccer league. And he also returned in September to meet a full FBI team of investigators. So we know that the Fusion GPS work of Christopher Steele was shared with the FBI as early as June. And this raises questions about James Comey, who exonerated Hillary Clinton at a time he was starting to learn about this Trump-Russia alleged collusion. And that I cannot explain. Robert Perry published another excellent column today at consortiumnews.com, and he begins by vilifying the Huffington Post for taking down Joe Laria's recent analysis, a very powerful one. And I don't want Laria's report to get lost in the noise about the Huffington Post's attempted censorship. Joe Laria brilliantly pointed out that both Fusion GPS, which was paid to do the Steele opposition research, and CrowdStrike, the company that asserted that its investigation of the DNC servers proved that Russia hacked them, both were bought and paid for by the Clinton campaign. And that's a very important bit of analysis that people should be aware of. But it was considered off limits by the Huffington Post, which removed it. Bob Perry notes that when he first went to Washington in the 1970s, during the Cold War, there are many prominent mainstream journalists who looked askance at the excessive demonization of the Soviet Union. Today, however, he cannot think of a single prominent figure in the mainstream news media who questions any claim, no matter how unlikely or absurd, that vilifies Putin and his country. It is all Russia bashing all the time. And then he talks about Laria's story, how it was removed without explanation by the editors at the Huffington Post. They did tell a BuzzFeed reporter that they were responding to reader complaints the article was filled with factual errors, but they didn't cite a single one. And I've read the story. I find no errors. The only mistake Joe Laria made was stepping out of line. And Perry links that to the demonization and the new requirement that RT register as a foreign agent because of alleged propaganda, which he says included reporting on Occupy Wall Street, examining the environmental dangers of fracking, and allowing third-party candidates to hold a presidential debate that the other networks wouldn't cover. These are insidious efforts by the Russians to undermine what's left of democracy in the U.S.? Give me a break. So I've linked to all of these items so that you can peruse them. The links are in the show file at peterbcollins.com. And over at Fox News, Shepard Smith has gone rogue. But they didn't take down his broadcast. They allowed him to air his views that the Hillary Clinton Uranium One scandal really is a whole lot of nothing. And I'm becoming persuaded of this. I have said in the past that Clinton, as Secretary of State, did not have the sole authority to approve the Uranium One deal. But what I have found outrageous is that her husband, Bill, got $500,000 for a speech in Moscow that included a private lunch with Putin. And there were large contributions to the Clinton Foundation from people involved in Uranium One, but the contributions occurred well before the alleged approval of this deal by Hillary Clinton. And so on close scrutiny, it evaporates except for the fat fee paid to Bill Clinton, which I think is pretty outrageous, but it's considered the new normal these days. Every day I pause for a moment to thank people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Casey Condon and Julie Dupree, who kick in $10 a month, Tracy Williams and DGL, who contribute $5 a month each. Would that be possible given your financial circumstances? I'd appreciate your support of my work. Come on over to peterbcollins.com, click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. When you get to the sign-up page, it just takes a minute to choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. And I thank you in advance. I've been a critic of the hot war in Yemen that evolved under President Obama, the entry of the Saudis in 2015. With continued strong support from the U.S. military, we refuel their planes, we replenish their armaments, we provide targeting information. And the Saudis are running a war that includes a famine and a cholera epidemic that can be perceived as war crimes. If the intent of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, is to starve Yemen into submission and to allow millions of people to die from cholera, the U.S. complicity would be seen as a war crime. And while it's toothless, Congressman Ro Khanna, who is a freshman from Silicon Valley, wrote a measure that passed by a vote of 366 to 30. Most of the 30 who voted against it felt that it was toothless. But this is a virtual majority of the House of Representatives complaining that Congress has not enacted specific legislation authorizing the use of military force in Yemen. But, of course, the Congress doesn't cut off funding or demand an end to the U.S. participation in these hostilities by a specific date. And Ro Khanna himself said, well, it's better than nothing. If I'm looking at something from a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of shifting U.S. foreign policy, maybe this is a 2. He'd like more, but it is a 2, he says. And across the Great Hall in Congress, Chris Murphy, senator and he's a Democrat from Connecticut, went on the floor yesterday, showed pictures of starving Yemeni children, and made some very dramatic statements. Quote, "There is a humanitarian catastrophe inside this country that very few people in this nation can locate on a map of absolutely epic proportion. This humanitarian catastrophe, this famine, is caused in part by the actions of the United States." And he went on to say, "The bombing campaign that targeted the electricity infrastructure in Yemen could only happen with U.S. support. It's the United States that provides the targeting assistance for Saudi planes. And we've basically completely destroyed the water infrastructure in the largest city in Yemen, Sana'a, and the electrical grid is non-functioning as well." So I commend these actions by Democrats, drawing attention to this bloody war in Yemen, the U.S. participation, and the fact that it's occurring outside of any rational war powers authority. I hope that this is not the end of this effort. The other big humanitarian tragedy right now is in Myanmar, the former Burma, where Rohingya Muslim minorities are being ethnically cleansed from the Rakhine state of Myanmar. And finally, the U.S. has piped up. Secretary of State Rexon Tillerson visited Myanmar. He was just there for a little time, but he did lecture Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel Prize-winning head of the civilian government in Myanmar, to investigate and halt the violence that has driven more than 600,000 Rohingya to flee to Bangladesh since August. And he used appropriate language. He called it horrific, crimes against humanity. And I hope that the government there will start to take action, but they're in deep denial. And the ethnic rivalry between Buddhists and Muslims there appears to be extremely deep. We have a report of a military coup in Zimbabwe where the world's oldest head of state, Robert Mugabe, age 93, has apparently been deposed. We hear of no reports of shots fired or people killed, so it does appear to be a bloodless transition. Back in July, when Trump was embarrassed by the Senate and House refusal to repeal and replace Obamacare, he tried to pander to and distract his base by tweeting out a ban on transgender persons serving in the military. And that's been largely put on hold by the courts. And today, the Pentagon approved a gender reassignment surgery for an active-duty military member. This is the first I'm aware of. And they required this person to go outside of the military medical facilities because their hospitals don't have the surgical expertise to perform this type of surgery. I consider this progress. In Australia, progress is coming as an historic popular vote. 61% of the people in an election that had participation of nearly 80% approved same-sex marriage. And Malcolm Turnbull, the prime minister, who I regard as a conservative, I don't know what his position on this was before the voters weighed in, but he wants a commitment to deliver marriage equality by Christmas. And I think that's a great idea. Richard Cordray, the first chief of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, a product of the Dodd-Frank financial reform law, is stepping down. He knows that he's not going to get much more done. They are busy chipping away at his power. The Congress overrode his effort to ban the forced use of arbitration, mandatory arbitration, and he can see the writing on the wall. So he's stepping down and is expected to run for governor of his home state of Ohio, and I think that race will be next year, if I'm not mistaken. A new last-minute surprise from Republicans, and this apparently is at the prodding of the tweeter-in-chief, but they've decided to include the repeal of Obamacare's personal mandate requiring people to have health insurance into the tax reform, is what they call it. And this is just another bald-faced effort to shift money from the poor and the middle class in order to fund tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy. And under the arcane rules of the Senate, I'm not even sure this works because reconciliation is only supposed to be about budget matters. But they're claiming that this would save $300+ billion over the next 10 years, and it allows them to pay for, they say, the corporate tax cuts and those for wealthy individuals. And we are learning that the way the law is written, that the individual provisions would expire at the end of 2025, but the corporate tax breaks will be permanent. Isn't that pretty? Doesn't that show you who Republicans consider to be their constituency? It's certainly not you and me. Well, California was the scene of another bloody mass killing, or at least multiple killing, yesterday, about 2 hours north of Sacramento, in a little town that is between Chico and Redding. A man named Kevin Neal first shot his wife to death on Monday night. Then he called his mom and said everything's falling apart. And Tuesday morning, he took some illegally homemade weapons a semi-automatic weapon, and went on a shooting spree in Tehama County. He went to a school where he shot both adults and children, and then he appeared to be out there kind of randomly killing people. He also did take out a woman who had filed a complaint about him that led to a restraining order in January. And at that time, they said that they would have required him to turn in any weapons that he had. We have no information as to whether he actually did that. The family knew he was a loose cannon, and we don't know why, when he called his mother on Monday night, that she didn't make an effort, and perhaps she did, we just don't know about it yet, but we're not aware of any effort she made to contact his wife who had been killed or any others who might be able to restrain him before he went on a binge as he did. And this sets up a new set of statistics from 2015, the most recent year that they are available for. Currently, it's estimated that Americans own about 265 million firearms. So it's roughly one for every American. I think there are over 330 million Americans now, so it's a little less than that. But only about a third of American adults say that they personally own a gun. It's 31%. Nevertheless, 3% of gun owners account for more than half of the guns that are in circulation. 3% own 133 million firearms. And the super gun owners, as they're called, have as many as 40 guns in their personal arsenals, and there are an estimated 7.7 million of those heavily armed Americans. It's just plain crazy, folks, and I don't see any end in sight. Thanks for listening to my News and Comment podcast. It's available daily on YouTube, and it's always available free. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.